Hello, this session is for summary and wrap-up. I'm Pilgi Hong at the Seoul Digital University. In this session, we'll summarize the previous lectures and try to draw some implications for your country. The subject of this session is implications for transformation toward a digital government. In this session, we try to summarize the previous lectures, and provide a forum for discussion on digital government in each country. This session is meant to encourage all the participants, to put the issues in perspective as a public manager of each country. This session also provides an opportunity to review the lectures and draw country-specific implications for digital transformation. So, you are expected to formulate a practical strategy and an implementable planning based on your country reality. Course objectives as follows. First, we'll try to summarize the lectures and review the issues for the digital government, and also try to put the issues in perspective on your country. And finally, we try to draw some country-specific implications. The course structures is as follows. I try to emphasize again and again the elements of the government and infrastructures of the e-government. So I'll try to summarize all the previous lectures except the best practices in Korea. And secondly, we'll try to draw some lessons learned from e-government in Korea and in general. And finally, we'll try to discuss the country-specific implications. Now, let's move on to the first subjective. As we mentioned, I'll try to summarize the key elements of e-government as in the previous lectures. So we can have a good infrastructure, and we can have a good e-government based on good infrastructures. And also, we need a solid, good legal foundation, which means we need a specific law, rule, and guidelines. And based on that legal foundation, we must have a good, solid governance, which means institutional arrangement. And based on those resources, we must develop good policy and strategy, and sometimes we have to develop project. And after we pick up good project, we also have to manage the project very well. Using these elements of e-government, we must make a good, solid e-government, and we must continue to enhance the government. Also, then we must continue to strengthen the e-government. By strengthening the e-government, we must broaden the scope of the government because we must change our society. We must change our politics. Using those elements of e-government, we can categorize the e-government as follows. In Korea case, we just categorized as follows. First, there is a transaction and service to the citizen, which is called G4C, Government for Citizen. And also, there is a transaction of business with the private sector, usually business. So we just call it Government to Business, G2B. And also, there should be a transaction and business between government agencies. We call it Government to Government. Also, the basis of the government is intra-organizational e-government, so-called intra-government. So, virtually, ICT can improve the way government does its internal and external businesses. And then we can categorize all the perspectives by just practical implementation of the government, depending on your own purposes. So, different perspectives need different staging, and different perspectives need different resources. Different perspectives need different approaches. For example, when you try to formulate a good plan, you can have a very nice, beautiful plan. But after you finish your good planning processes, implementability is a problem. So, in the process of planning good e-government strategy, you must take into consideration of implementability. And in addition to those implementability, we need a solid legal foundation. That's why we need legislation perspective. Also, Many countries face serious financial problems. In e-government, we also have common problems of financing, so-called budget perspective. Every time we try to do something, we must have money. But in many countries, as you know, we have some financial constraint. That's why we need a budget perspective when we try to have a good, solid e-government strategy. Also, we need to set up a performance criteria. Without performance criteria, after you finish your e-government, you will be asked whether the e-government is useful or not, because you don't provide solid metrics or provide solid evaluation criteria. So before you just start e-business, you must set a performance measurement or performance metric. Now we can rearrange all these elements of e-government surrounding e-government. Look at, I emphasized again and again the political leadership and law and regulation and solid governance. And based on those resources, we can develop policy tools. And we can enforce IT infrastructures. And also, in the long run, we must build ICT capacity. And depending on all these resource conditions, we can set up our performance target. And also, we must get continuous feedback from the stakeholders. And also, in the process of implement the government and operate the government, we must change management. Virtually, we try to set up a virtuous circle of e-government depending on demand and supply system. In this case, when we have a new demand of public services, the government is supposed to provide e-services. So we try to set up a virtuous cycle of demand and provision as follows. When there is demand for public services, we must develop policy and regulation. And then based on those policy and regulations, we can provide e-government services. Then we must get feedback from the stakeholders. Also, as the new technology emerges, we must update our e-government system. Then the new government comes in. That's sort of a virtuous circle of e-government. Now, just move on to the second subject, the key infrastructures of e-government in Korea, especially in Korea. We categorized the key infrastructures in government into 4 areas. But you don't have to categorize this way. You can have your own criteria for category. For example, in Korea, we have services and standard for interoperability and key systems like NBIS, National Basic Information System, or Government Integrated Data Center and IRM, Information Resource Management. You don't have to follow this scheme. You can have your own scheme. Then let's move on to the next topic, key e-government services. Likewise, you don't have to follow these rules. You can have your own scheme. In Korean, we just have 4 categories. For example, government for citizen, as I mentioned earlier, and also government to government. And recently, we have a COVID-19 pandemic. So we put in K-quarantine system, Korean disease prevention system. So K-quarantine system was brought in response to COVID-19 global pandemic. Also, we try to continue to promote open public data policy and try to promote data sharing. Using all the previous elements and perspectives, we can identify some basic action items. One framework or groundwork for action items is suggested by OECD as follows. For example, we can take some inclusive processes, and also we can take regulatory framework. And digital rights are a very important issue, and transparency for accountability is always an important issue in public sector. Also, we need to develop digital skills and always continue to rethink public procurement. Another action items suggested by OECD is as follows. I don't want to go into detail because that was suggested by the previous lecturer. Having said it, what is Korean government doing? Going forward, the Korean government is also trying to improve service and improve infrastructure, and also try to make use of data and promote private-public collaboration as follows. Based on those principles and those elements, the Korean government is preparing another digital government roadmap. For example, we need a virtuous cycle of data, cloud, AI, and other technologies. And also we try to innovate the entire cycle of government services and try to bring in ecosystem and also secure government, capacity building, and refinement of the institution and procedures. All those elements will be included in roadmap for Korean government. Now we just came to our issue. Yeah, we learned a lot about general principle of e-government and the best practices in Korea. Does it work for your country? No, it may not work for your country. So we must ask ourselves, why should we do e-government in your country and in our country? Everybody knows this is a critical moment in history. Everybody says this moment is very critical in history. Considering the rapidly changing digital technologies, this is a really, really critical moment in history. So we must stay ahead of the curve. Once we fall behind the trend, it will be extremely difficult to catch up with. So let's move on. To try to build a good e-government, government must cooperate with civil society and private sector. They all together should collaborate to craft a shared national vision in participatory way. As you can see here, no matter how the technology innovative it is, technology will not guarantee success. We must cooperate each other to succeed. I mentioned and I emphasize in particular, e-government is all about making connections. And digital inclusion is also essential to inclusive economic growth and sustainable economy. Now, let's move on to the lessons learned briefly. I mentioned many times we need a strong, consistent leadership and legal foundation. Also, we need to pick up priority areas. And also, we need to develop a good national strategy. And also, we have a balanced approach to infrastructure because there is a need for balanced approach between infrastructure and services. Without services, what is the infrastructure for? Now, having reviewed and learned a lot about general principles in Korean cases, you must consider your own circumstances based on maturity or level of your country and based on some resource constraint and financial constraint. Let's take a look at where we are, where your country is. Then we can identify the gaps and we can identify the constraint, we can identify the best approach. So at the end of this session, what should we do? What should we do first for your e-government? Answer is on your own. I wish you all have a good e-government. I hope you have an excellent government. Thank you.